Hey, what's up YouTube? This is tcgsam here, and in today's video, I'll be talking about some of the most interesting rogue decks that we have in the current Phantom Revenge format. I'll be going over which level of tournament I think that they can compete at, of course with YCS contender being the most competitive, all the way down to locals contender for the quote-unquote just for fun decks. If you guys haven't checked out my meta tier list already, that's where I talk about some of the more competitive center decks, so be sure to check that out using the link in the description if you're interested. But in today's video, I'll be talking about some of the decks that are maybe less represented, but could still have some potential to do some damage in the metagame. Of course, I can't possibly cover every single deck that could potentially do something in metagames, so do keep that in mind, but without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with the Labrynth deck, I think Lab is probably a regionals contender, even though it did lose the Dimensional Barrier, and RVS to set Dimensional Barrier during turn 0 was one of its strongest plays. I think the deck is still fine at a regionals level. I don't think it'll do too well at a YCS because it doesn't really have that sort of unfair factor that it used to have when it was able to loop Dimensional Barrier or use it turn 0. So I think the ban list did actually hurt this deck a little bit. It kind of feels like this deck is a little bit too fair now. It will be able to generate a good amount of advantage over time, but compared to some of the best decks that we have right now, I think it just is a little bit too slow, and it kind of just gets run over by almost every single one of the best decks right now, just because its end board isn't anything particularly great without a card like Dimensional Barrier. It's very good at generating resources, but it just probably isn't going to be enough to stop your opponent from just overwhelming you. So for all those reasons, I'll say Labrynth is probably still an okay deck at a regionals level, but I don't think it's good enough to compete at a YCS. Next up is Tenpai. Tenpai is interesting because these blind second decks will kind of vary in strength from format to format, and I feel like the fact that Tenpai has lost so much of its consistency too just makes it so this deck, even when it has like the perfect hand going second, has like the right combination of hand traps or board breakers, if your opponent just like throws like a single Imprimer Veiler on a Chandra, sometimes that can just be enough. This deck just simply lacks the extenders that it used to have. I think for all those reasons and the fact that it is a going second deck, which means it can just get blown out by like decks with their unfair combos going first, I'm probably just going to put this in a local contender. I would say a big thing holding it back is not necessarily the fact that it has to go second, but just the fact that its engine is so weak now, after it lost so much a few ban lists ago. And then next up we got RB. I've seen some builds of like RB K9 running around the internet, but I'm not really too sure that the engine of this deck is that great, and the fact that it has some potential with being able to be used with the K9 cards means I think that there's maybe something going for this deck. I think it might have even topped like a regionals or something before, so I'll probably put in the regionals contender for that reason. I personally don't think the RB engine is too great myself, but the fact that some people have been experimenting with it and it has seen some success at least at the regionals level makes me think this placement is pretty justified. And then next up we have Dragon Ruler. It's definitely a good deck in Genesis format, but talking about the advanced format, I don't think Dragon Ruler is particularly great. It is a deck that will probably struggle going second because it just has a very big engine and it isn't really able to play the highest count of non-engine. That's probably something I'll be saying a lot throughout this video for most of these decks, but Dragon Rulers especially, I think while it is a good combo deck too, I don't even think when it gets to go first, its end board is like particularly broken. Yes, they have a way to get to like Archsword Christia and then revive it off of one of their like rank 7s, but to get there, they pretty much have to go uninterrupted, and I think every single relevant deck is going to be able to win when going first uninterrupted. So I don't think that Dragon Ruler has anything particularly good going for it. I think this deck could be good enough to play at a local tournament, but I don't really think it's that competitively viable, at least not at the moment. And then next up is Gem Knight, and I'm personally surprised that's actually seen some success at a YCS level. There's usually like 1 or 2 Gem Knights and like almost every single top 32 for these big events, and that's pretty shocking to me because I personally think that when you're playing a deck that chooses the blind second, it can be incredibly scary when the best decks in the format are setting up these almost unbreakable boards. But I think unlike Tenpai Dragon, Gem Knight's engine is actually very solid. They have many starters, many extenders, a bunch of one-card combos. And unlike Tenpai 2, there is a combo for Gem Knight to be able to go first and set up an Archsword Christia. If you want to see the combo, I believe it was in a deck profile shown for YCS Pittsburgh. But I think Gem Knight is one of those decks where going second is its main goal, but it has that option to go first when your opponent forces them to go first, or you can pull a fast one on your opponent and actually choose to go first post-siding, which can catch them off guard. Combined with the fact that it has already seen YCS results, I think that Gem Knight is probably going to be the first deck I'm going to put in YCS contender. It's definitely a very scary deck that can just absolutely destroy you with a single card and just OTK you from there if you aren't able to stop it. Alright, next up is going to be DDD. DDD was a deck that maybe initially got some hype when it was coming out of Doom and Dimensions, and I personally think that DDD has some potential still, but it does just kind of feel like blank combo swap deck, where when it goes first, great, it's able to set up an unbreakable board and win, but going second, it just either doesn't have enough room for non-engine, or its engine is just not really good at going second, and that's probably the case for a lot of the decks that are on this list. So I don't think DDD stands out from them in any particular way there, but maybe something DDD has going for it that some of these other combo decks don't is the fact that I think it is kind of resilient to like certain hand traps, even against a hand trap like Droll and Lockbird. I think the DDD deck has like solid ways around that. DDD is also able to set up a pretty nasty floodgate where if they control 2 DDD pendulum scales, I think the only thing your opponent can do is like link some with their monsters. They can't like Xyz, fusion, or synchro them away, and that can be pretty devastating against some decks. A big downside of DDD though is that it is a very complex deck. I always mention that in a long tournament, I think you want to make it so you're less prone to making mistakes and you make as few of them as possible. So playing a deck like DDD that's so complicated with so many possible branches, I think it's just not going to be able to do super well at a long tournament like a YCS unless you're like the expert with that deck. But for the average player, I'll probably say that DDD is probably good enough to play at regionals, but that's about it. And then next up is Monarch. Monarch did actually get a regionals win, I believe, a few weeks ago. I thought that was pretty shocking because I've never considered this deck to be anywhere remotely meta relevant. It once again falls into the same category of, okay, if I get to go first, pop up uninterrupted, I have this like unfair win condition that my opponent's just not going to be able to beat, and that's the domain of the Monarchs. Realistically, no deck's playing spell and trap removal. If you summon like a Vandy's Fiend, slap down a domain of the Monarchs, like you win the game. But I think the biggest problem, once again, is when this deck has to go second. And the fact that it isn't playing cards in the extra deck means not only will your opponent pretty much know exactly what you're on and they can sort of tailor their end board to Monarch specifically, it also means that you're also limited in terms of extra deck utility like SP Little Knight that some decks have when going second. I think Monarch kind of just once again falls into that same category of great going first, bad going second. And I don't think that Monarch has anything else that's like particularly great about it. It's already a deck that used to struggle with consistency. I think that's something that still continues to haunt it, being a tribute deck and all that. However, because it did have that regionals win, I will have to give it a little bit credit. I'll put it at the bottom of regionals contender, although I personally don't believe that much in this deck. And then next up we have Exosister. Exosister, once again, is a great deck in Genesis format, but I don't think it's very good in our current format. It's probably a fine enough deck going first. Like, the Exosister monster effects can be pretty annoying for decks that want to move stuff out of the graveyard, like Yummy. But once again, going second, this deck is going to have its issues. And that's something, I'm going to sound like a broken record when saying this, but a lot of these rogue decks just have that same problem of being great when going first, but they just don't have necessarily the right tools to consistently win when going second. And Exosisters once again falls into that category. Exosister doesn't necessarily have like an unbreakable board when going first too. Yeah, it can be pretty good if they set up their full board. I think it's like 2 or 3 banishes. It doesn't even have that auto win potential like decks like Monarch or DDD might potentially have. So for all those reasons, I'll probably put it at the top of like locals contender. It's like not a terrible deck by any means, but it's not really going to be doing too much in the metagame right now in my opinion. That probably will change though when we get the Exosister cards in the next set. So the next time I do this tier list, Exosister is probably going to be moving a little bit higher, but at least at the moment with Phantom Revenge, I don't think this deck is too great. And then next up we got Heroes. Heroes can be a pretty scary combo deck when it does get to go off. It has access to powerful cards like Darklaw, which can just shut out decks like Draco completely. It has access to DPE, which is also still a pretty decent card even despite its age. This deck just also has a bunch of gas as well, so it's able to sometimes gas through like the low impact hand traps. Going second, sometimes even Engine alone can make some sort of an impact against like the end boards of the best decks that we have right now. But ultimately, I do feel like this deck is too weak to certain hand traps like Charmies. It's forced to play an engine that's way too big in my opinion and with way too many engine requirements. So I would say for all those reasons combined, like I maybe will generously put it in like regionals contender. I don't think it's had a good regionals result yet, but I feel like if there were any like deck from the locals contender tier that could topple regionals, it would probably be Heroes. They just keep getting like new support, and some of their cards are actually pretty good. They basically have a lot of cards that like are one card combos that are able to set up like quite a scary end board. But I just feel like this deck has way too many engine requirements, and it is a little too weak to certain hand traps for me to really put it any higher or believe in it. And then next up we got Odion. Odion did actually win that YCS a few weeks ago, which was pretty shocking to me. I don't think this deck is like particularly crazy. Of course, when it gets to go first, it has pretty solid engine, is able to generate quite a bit of advantage off of off of just their engine alone. Their interruptions aren't bad by any means, but ultimately I just feel like it falls in a similar boat as Labrynth. It doesn't necessarily do anything super unfairly. It's not like it has a floodgate that's able to consistently get to that will just completely shut the opponent out, unless you count like Baguska, I guess. But the fact that it did win that YCS means I have to give it at least a little bit of credit. I'd probably say I would personally put it as like a good regional stack, but because it did win that YCS, I am going to give it a little bit more credit and put it in the YCS contender. For a control deck, it is pretty consistently able to get to its engine and generate a bunch of resources, a bunch of recursion, and it should be able to shut out your opponents when they get to go first. And going second, the fact that it's able to play some of the Dominus cards means that they at least have access to some non-engine capabilities. So I do feel like in terms of control decks, Odion's probably one of the better ones, although personally, I don't think it's going to necessarily be popping up too often in the future. And then next up, we got True Draco. I believe True Draco did get some new support in Doom Dimensions. I'm pretty sure Diagram is back at 3 now. But even despite all that, True Draco I think is just a deck that's like really outdated. Masterpiece just shouldn't be a problem for most of the best decks that we have in the format right now. Every single deck is probably playing at least one way to out this card. Especially if they're respecting decks like Lunalight, which are playing towers-like monsters anyway. I feel like unless this deck sort of takes the Monarch approach and tries to play like floodgates, like the Monarchs Erupt to shut out your opponents, it's not going to be good enough to stand up against any of the meta decks unless they do have those floodgates in there. The fact that it can play floodgates means that like it's not like in the bottom tier, but I don't think it's a deck that'll be doing anything past the locals level. And then next up, we got Fire King. And Fire King is a deck that I actually like quite a lot because it does match up fairly well into a lot of the common non-engine that we have in the format right now. So cards like the Mulcharmies aren't really good against Fire King. Nibiru is pretty bad against it. Droll and Lockbird is pretty bad against it. And these are cards that are very common in a lot of people's stacks. Fire King's engine is also kind of strong when you start putting cards like the Drak stuff into it. Getting access to a on-demand board wipe can be very hard for certain decks to deal with. Not to mention, Fire King has already seen some results at the YCS level too, so for all those reasons, I would say that Fire King is definitely a YCS contending level deck. It's a very good deck, and it's definitely one of the best rogue decks that we have in the format right now. I will say maybe it's not great into a deck like Draco Tail because they have cards like Arthalion to be able to remove monsters without triggering like their destruction effects, but other than that, I think the Fire King deck itself has quite a lot going for it. Going second, it's able to play Impulse. It can even use its Kirin as a hand trap potentially if they see the right combination of cards. So I do think that Fire King is a very solid rogue deck and definitely one of the best ones that we have right now. Next up is Dragon Link. I thought this one was worth talking about because this can sort of be equated to like any Bestial Control or Dragon Turbo type of deck. The main thing I think this deck has going for it is that it is able to play a high count of Bestials. Bestials are pretty solid into the Yummy deck, are very good into the Mitsurugi deck. But outside of that, I'm not really sure if this deck has anything super crazy going for it. It's been a while since this deck has seen any results at all. That'll probably change in the next set with Burst Protocol when it does get new support. But at least at the time of recording in Phantom Revenge format, I don't think this deck's going to be doing anything at all. I'll put it at like the locals level, just because being able to play a high count of Bestials might be able to carry it in some matchups. And then next up we have Chimera. Chimera has really fallen off the face of the earth these past few months. It used to be a pretty solid fusion deck where it has like one-hit combos, which is pretty unheard of in any fusion deck. Not to mention, it also had pretty layered end boards. It's able to do some unfair things like search the Dark Barrier statue and summon it out to the field. But ultimately, I think it's just fallen off because it is also one of those decks where, yes, going first, you are probably going to win the game. But going second, your engine is just, it's not very good into most boards. And it is a deck that isn't able to play a super high count of non-engine. So it is going to struggle when going second. So I think it'll probably go with the other decks that fall in the same category. Definitely good enough to win when going first, but going second, I think that's where it's going to have its issues. Next up, we have Voiceless Voice. This one is a deck that we also haven't seen for quite a while, and I think for a good reason. This deck's ceiling is just incredibly low, and maybe back in the day, that was good enough to win against certain decks, but nowadays, I think that a lot of the best decks are just not really going to struggle against the Voiceless Voice end board. It just simply doesn't do enough, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, it's good until like all the common non-engine that we have, like Fire King, but unlike Fire King, I don't think its end boards are actually anywhere close to being good enough to stop the opponent. And of course, going second, this deck, even though it's able to play a high number of non-engine, its engine itself can be very easy to stop if the opponent knows what they're doing. Just cutting off low completely kind of just makes it completely implode on itself and not really do too much. So I feel like for those reasons, I'll probably put it like maybe top of locals contender, bottom of regionals contender. Like maybe it could do something at a regionals level, but I just feel like if you want to play a mid-range deck, there's just definitely better ones out there. And then next up is Tearlaments. I don't think this deck is very good in my opinion, but the fact that it has that sort of BS factor where it's going to be able to just mill crazy sometimes, and the opponent's not going to be able to do a single thing about it. Makes people want to put it in the regionals contender tier. I don't think it's had a regionals result for quite a while, but the fact that it has that potential to do almost anything in the game, it might be good enough to sneak a few results here or there at the regionals level. But if it does rely on RNG like that, I don't think it's going to be doing good enough at like the YCS contender level. Next up, we got Salad. The only reason I'm putting Salad in here in the first place is because I did see a deck profile a few weeks ago where the quote-unquote new technology for Salad might be like the Radiant Typhoon level 3s, where they're able to summon themselves out for free, and then from there be able to go into Mirage Stalio. I'm not really too sure if that's something that this deck necessarily needs, because I don't think it was struggling for those free level 3s before. Like, for example, they could have always just played like Speedroid Terratop and it would have accomplished the same thing. But outside of that, I think as a mid-range deck, Salamangreat's like fine. It sort of feels like Voiceless Voice, where its end board's just not going to be super great, but it is a deck that is pretty good into common and non-engine like Droll Lockbird, I suppose. But maybe outside of that, I don't really think it has anything too great going for it. But because it has that one regionals result, I will put it in the regionals contender tier. It's fine as a mid-range deck, but I don't think it does anything particularly crazy. Spright, on the other hand, I think is actually kind of an underrated deck right now. Spright is not necessarily great into some of the non-engine that we have, like the Charmies, but I do think the fact that this deck has like decent ways around Droll and Lockbird, it has a built-in way to beat Nibiru, is able to play an unfair card in Ibly, just like Ibly lock the opponent. Those are all reasons why I think that Spright might be a rogue deck that has some potential in the format right now. I just think that there hasn't been a good level 2 engine that's able to keep up with like the Spright cards themselves. So back in the day, people used to play cards like Melfi or the Evil Twins, but I think nowadays those cards have kind of just fallen off a little bit and are not particularly great. So I think that sort of caused Spright to fall off to the wayside. But personally, I think that the Spright engine is still very good. They're basically like the yummy monsters, where if you stick a guy on the board, they're able to spam out infinite bodies from the hand. So personally, I would put Spright as like a deck that has potential at the regionals level, although of course it does have its fair share of issues. They do need to stick a monster on the board to get the rest of their monsters out of their hand. If the opponent knows that, this deck is not too hard to beat. Next up, we got Regenesis. I think this deck has seen some regional success recently. I would say the biggest thing going for Regenesis is that it just doesn't really lose to any of the common non-engine that we have right now. So I think that's one main thing it has going for it, because it does kind of play that slower mid-rangey/control style of gameplay. You can also splash in the Kashtira cards like Kashtira Unicorn, and Kashtira Unicorn is still a pretty strong card against some decks that we have right now. So maybe for all those reasons, I'll probably put it at like also okay enough deck to play at regionals. It does have some things going for it that some of these other decks up here don't, but it ultimately is in a similar boat as Voiceless Voice in my opinion. Sometimes its end boards just aren't going to be good enough, and it's just going to get run over by any of the competent meta decks that we have right now. Next up, we got Purrely, and Purrely I think is not in a great spot at the moment. Not only can this deck be kind of weak to common non-engine that we have in the format right now, the fact that people are also respecting Lunalight, Liger Dancer, means most decks are going to have at least some way to out a towers-like monster. And of course, that's what the Purrely deck does. So if people are playing outs to towers in their deck, then I don't think the Purrely deck's going to have too great of a time. Don't get me wrong, I think the engine is actually one of the better ones at going second compared to some of these other decks out here. But I think the fact that its main win condition going first is going to get shut down more often than it would like. I probably have to put it like maybe top of locals contender. I just don't think a format where people are respecting Lunalight can be a format where Purrely ends up doing well. Next up, we got Runick, and I guess this could include like any Runick variant, but I was mainly thinking about like the more slow Runick control variants. I honestly think this deck is not great at the moment. It's just a little bit too slow. While the Runick cards are still fine, I suppose, like the quality of the Runick cards are still okay. I just feel like once again, it's a deck that's going to get completely obliterated by like some of the best decks that we have, unless they see like specific floodgates. So I think it falls in a similar boat as True Draco. Yeah, if you see the right combination of floodgates, your opponent's not going to be able to do anything. But I ultimately think that this type of deck is a little bit too slow and just not good enough at holding the opponent back with just engines. So ultimately, I'll have to put it in the locals contender tier. Evil Twin Fiendsmith, I think, is also a deck that has fallen off the face of the earth completely from a few months ago, where it was even considered a tier 1 deck. Nowadays, I think that it's still an okay enough deck. Like, its main weakness is to Mulcharmy Fulos, but outside of that, it plays fairly well into some of the common engine that we have, like Droll Lockbird. It's able to get access to the Fiendsmith engine, which is still very good. And of course, the Live Twin end board is nothing to scoff at either. It's still a fair number of interruptions and gives them quite a bit of follow-up. It definitely isn't the best combo deck that we have up here, it probably is a combo deck that's a little bit more resilient than some of the other combo decks like Heroes or DDD that we have in the Regionals Contender tier. So I personally think that Evil Twin Fiendsmith has some things going for it. If you really want to play it, it could probably do well enough at a Regionals level because it was a tier 1 deck not too long ago. But ultimately, I don't think it's good enough to play at a YCS because of its big Fua problem. Like, every deck's going to be playing it, and you're eventually going to run to that card and just not have a way to beat it. Rescue Ace is in an interesting spot too. While Turbulence is still kind of a crazy card being able to set 4, it just doesn't really feel like it's enough anymore. It almost feels like it's trying to do what Draco does, like set up an end board with like a bunch of back row that's able to disrupt the opponent, maybe 1 or 2 interruptions in its monster form. But unlike Draco, this deck just doesn't really have any of the same strengths. It's not able to play the same high count of non-engine. It's not able to have like powerful going second cards in its engine like Ketu or Rahu in the Draco deck, so it does almost feel like Draco at home in some sense, but less consistent. I'd probably put in the low-cost contender tier. Like, the cards are still fine, I guess, but unless I'm mistaken, I believe like one of their cards is still on, might still be on the ban list, and that means the deck is like even less consistent than it should be. But even if this deck is at full power, I ultimately don't think that this deck is really that good enough to compete in the metagame right now, especially because its back row that it sets compared to Draco at least, I don't think is nearly as good. The fact that it's trying to emulate the Draco style of gameplay maybe means that in a format where Draco can succeed, this deck could potentially do something, but ultimately I don't think it's like that. Next up, we got Radiant Typhoon. I think Radiant Typhoon is a decent mid-range / control deck. I believe it has some like regional results already, but even if it doesn't, I think this is one of the decks that could actually do well enough there. It's able to generate quite a bit of resources. It has very good grind game. So against some of the more grindy decks, this is a deck that I think could do some damage. Maybe it'll struggle a bit against like the combo decks because its end board isn't necessarily unfair by any means, but I think this deck's engine is solid enough when going first. It's able to play a good enough number of non-engine going second, and ultimately it is also going to be getting new support in the next set, I believe, so placement will probably change once we get that, but for now I think it's good enough to compete at a regional level at least. For the penultimate deck, we got Drytron. Drytron did get some support recently, and the engine in Drytron wasn't that bad before to begin with, I think. So I would say its biggest weakness is definitely going to come down to Drone Lockbird. And the fact that Drone Lockbird is still a pretty common side against a deck like Mitsurugi means I think that this deck is going to struggle quite a lot with that, unfortunately. It doesn't really have that same level of consistency or power as Mitsurugi in my opinion, and even though Mitsurugi does lose to Drone Lockbird, I do feel like it is just a step above Drytron in terms of card quality. Despite that though, Drytron is a deck that I think that could have the potential to do good enough at a regionals level if they're able to dodge all the Drone Lockbirds, because going first, this deck can almost do anything. It can do like Vandy's Ruler, just set up a bunch of interaction with this engine alone. There's quite a few things that this deck has going for it when going first, and going second I don't think it's the worst either, because any 2 level 1s is able to threaten a Zeus very easily. So for all those reasons, I'll probably put it at like the regionals level. It's definitely a deck that I think is very high rolly, that can be very high rolly, but I don't think it's a deck that's awful by any means. And then finally we got the Fiendsmith Variants. I'm talking more like Fiendsmith control, but I guess in general I'll be focusing on like the Fiendsmith engine as a whole. This is an engine that hasn't been very common in our metagame recently. That could be for a few reasons, like the top decks just maybe don't have a reason to play this because they're good enough. They don't need to add in extra bricks to increase their ceiling because their ceiling is already high enough. Or they just don't have that right synergy with Fiendsmith once they lose access to Moon. There are a couple different reasons I think why this engine has fallen off. But ultimately, I think in terms of card quality, Fiendsmith is still a deck that could do good enough at a YCS level in my opinion. Not only will it give strong grind game, a card like Caesar is still very good into most of the metagame that we have at the moment. I think it just kind of requires the right engine for it to be paired with for it to actually see results at a YCS level. But at least even now, I'm still seeing results for like Fiendsmith Mitsurugi, Fiendsmith Raizio sneak into like top 32 of YCSs. So ultimately, I do think the Fiendsmith engine is good enough to compete, although maybe at the moment it just doesn't have the right deck to go along with it for it to really shine. Alright, so that's going to do it for this rogue deck tier list. Let me know what you guys thought about it in the comment section below. Do you guys agree or disagree with anything that I said? I'm curious to hear what you think. Again, do keep in mind that this is just my opinion and my opinion only. And also keep in mind that I'm mostly trying to compare these decks to like other rogue decks, because I think all these decks are just a step below the tier 1 decks that we have right now that I showed on my meta deck tier list. If you guys found this video helpful, then all I ask is that you subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps keep me motivated to continue posting more videos like this and make sure that you're able to see these videos as soon as they release. And with that, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.